Hi everybody, my name is Jens Larsen. You are probably already working on improvising over giant steps, because giant steps is really like the most difficult progression that you have to master if you want to consider yourself a real jazz guitarist. And that might not be entirely true. At the same time, when you have changes that move like that, when you're changing key or at least changing scale very often, then you're working on skills that you also need if you're playing other difficult pieces. And as I've also talked about in other videos, then the giant step cycle is really close to just a turnaround with altered dominance. So in that way, if you're working on giant steps, you're actually also working on progressions like rhythm changes and all the other progressions where you can use turnarounds with altered dominance. If you want to learn more about jazz guitar, about improvising over chord changes, checking out some interesting arpeggios and chord voicings, then subscribe to my channel. If you want to make sure not to miss anything, then click the little bell notification icon next to the subscribe button. The first approach is just improvising with the basic arpeggios. I think we're all aware that that's possible, and I also think that most of us skate over that a little bit fast. In a way, that's really a pity. I find that the more I return to this, the more I learn, because it's a really nice way to just really dig into the harmony. And actually, you can also make some really good lines that you wouldn't think that you could make because you're just thinking, oh, I'm just going to play up and down the arpeggio. But if you really know what you're doing when you're working with this, then even with these 4 basic notes, you can make some really cool lines. So if we just try to cover this position here, so we have the B major, and that's the arpeggio then in the 7th fret. And then we need one for D7, that could be this one if we shift up a fret. And then in the same position, G major 7. And then a B flat 7. And an E flat. So now I kind of covered this entire area of the neck, and we have material that we can work with if we want to improvise. There are of course many ways you can work on it. I think when you're working on giant steps, you probably want to just sit down and see if you can, in rubato, come up with some lines. An example of a line could be something like... So here I'm really just starting with the root, even on the first chord, and then just down the arpeggio. Notice that I'm not like really just stuck with the basic arpeggio shape or the starting on the root and then going up. I'm also going to be using inversions a lot, so that one, then starting on the 3rd for the next chord, so D7, and then I have to remember what I played because I'm not sure if I did it like this, but I think I played the B and then just this G major triad, and I think I played this shape on the B flat 7, resolving to the E flat. So in that way, really just using 3 notes per chord here. G major triad, and then on the 7th, root, 7th, down to the 5th, and then resolving to the 3rd of the E flat major 7. I'm gonna write this out so you can see what's going on. I hope I remember what I played. But you get the idea of it anyway, and you can make pretty convincing lines just doing this. That's kind of clear. The way you want to practice this, of course, you want to just sit down and see if you can come up with lines using the material. So stuff like this, and then just try and work through it and think ahead, see if you can look at what's going on, have a good overview of the arpeggio. And anyway, exercises like this is going to help you in any key on any progression. You cannot know this well enough. It doesn't really matter if you're working on this on giant steps. It's going to help you playing a blues in F just the same. That doesn't really matter. A great exercise to work on getting this overview of the arpeggios is to try and play them as the never-ending, well, I know it as the never-ending scale exercise, but you would also, in this case, I guess, call it the never-ending arpeggio exercise. So that means that we're just going to play the B major arpeggio for four notes, and then shift to the closest note in the D7, and then play that 4 notes, and then in that way move through the form, keeping the direction going also. And that's really going to help you just thinking ahead and having a good overview of all these different arpeggios that you need. So that sounds like this. Take it a little bit further, you get the idea. It's a difficult thing to actually have in one position and to work with like this, but it's really good if you want to have a really strong overview of what is going on. And when you start working with this, it's really also going to open up your ability to make melodies with these arpeggios. Another way to get to create some interesting lines over the giant steps chord changes is to rethink the progression or reinterpret it to be other chords. So one way that I think even Coltrane does this in some of his later versions of the song, or at least he has this bass movement going on, and that is that we have a B major 7 and then it modulates down to a G major 7, and then in between we have a D7, but instead of the G7 we can also add, instead of the D7 we can have an A minor 7, and then down to G major 7, and then that can continue, so we have an F minor 7 down to E flat major 7. So in that way we have this sort of stepwise movement going down through the changes, and that's really useful to check out, because that's gonna make the melodies that we make when we're using this way of thinking. You can't only do that probably, because, or at least not if you're being too obvious about it, but it's just nice to also have these lines available and have that way of coming up with some lines that fit really well with this progression. So probably the way you want to check out this is just to do it really in a basic way first, so really just doing the basic arpeggios. Don't be afraid to move around the neck when you're doing this, because the point is really that you want to have something that's really playable. Of course, you can also start working with lines that are using this idea, but then are maybe a little bit less obvious. It's starting with a really basic B major, but already the A minor is sort of moved in a different way to this one, then more basic G major, and then again another place for the F and the F minor and the E flat within this position. So I'm being more free about how I'm playing the melodies and a little bit less systematic, but the fact that I can just think this movement is just going to give me the ability to come up with some other types of lines. The third approach is also reinterpreting the harmony, but now we're going to use the fact that we can shift one of the chords so that we don't have to think so many different types of chords. So because in the previous one I was still thinking a major 7, then a minor 7, then a major 7, but you can also reinterpret it so that everything is going to become one type of chord. And that's the idea here. I'm going to keep the tonic, so we're going to reinterpret everything into major 7 chords. And that means that we have B major 7, and then instead of the D7, so similar to using the A minor 7, we can of course use a C major 7. And then G, and then instead of the B flat 7, we're going to use an A flat major 7. And then E flat major 7. So the idea here is that the melodies that I'm going to make are going to be shifting up a half step, moving from B major to C major, or from G to A flat. So you get lines like this. So here I'm really using just the basic Coltrane pattern, and then doing sort of moving a triad on the G chord and then up to the A flat, and then resolving that to E flat major 7. So it's just another way of thinking, and yet another way of coming up with other types of lines, creating another movement, because when we're reinterpreting the chords like this, then we're going to come up with other melodies. And that's the point of this approach as well. On guitar, we often use sort of visual references, and we think about how arpeggios and how chords look, and that's also something that we can actually use when we're trying to make lines on a progression like giant steps. So if I just play the first few bars using 3-note voicings, then that could be something like this. So fairly basic voicings, and of course you can find ways of doing this anywhere on the neck and use that. And you can also turn that into lines, or at least use that as a blueprint for a way of making lines, and use the basic shapes that you just played. So in this case, I can make some completely different melodies just thinking like this. Of course, if you start working with it a little bit more, you can also find sort of ways of playing these melodies that are maybe a little bit easier. Right now I'm really trying to work with having all the interesting intervals in there, and that is making the line a little bit more difficult to play. But at the same time you do get completely different sounds, and it still makes sense because you know the sound of them when you're playing them as chords. And I think that's a really interesting thing to also try and work with, that aspect of playing guitar and using the visual thing in a direct, creative way when we're working with lines like this. And of course something that's also very often connected to giant steps and Coltrane changes is pentatonic scales, mainly because Coltrane is using the the Coltrane patterns, which are, at least the way I've learned them, really just parts of pentatonic scales. And you can do that as well. In this case, I'm just going to use really two different pentatonic scales and then move them through the changes. And this is also something that can be really useful. And again, it's something that's also going to work well with any kind of difficult chord progression, whether it's very early or giant steps or a moment's notice. It's always useful to just look at, well, can I maybe make some sort of other movement with pentatonic scales, and is that going to give me the ability to play certain melodies? In this case, it's also just using the fact that pentatonic scales is something that we just know so well on guitar that we want to use that, and it has a specific sound, so it's also going to give us a different sound, some different sounding material that we can add to our vocabulary when we're improvising on a song like Giant Steps, because it is difficult to not get caught in just sounding the same all the time. So you do need to check out different approaches when you're working on a progression like that. So what I'm doing is I'm just going to use, for the major 7 chords, I'm going to use the minor pentatonic scale from the 3rd. So for the B major, that's a D sharp minor. I'm going to use the pentatonic scale from the 5th of the dominance. So that's an A minor for the D7. And then we have the G major. So the 3rd of G major is B, so that's a B minor. The B flat 7, so the 5th is F, so that means that we have F minor pentatonic, and then for the E flat major 7 we have a G minor pentatonic. And if you make lines with this, then that could sound something like this. So really the idea here is that I'm just playing a pattern on from the D sharp or E flat minor pentatonic, moving up to the closest note in the A, which is actually just hitting a place where I can play the exact same pattern, and then moving that to the B minor, which is in this case being a B minor 7 arpeggio, and then moving to the F minor, and then down to the G on the E flat major 7. And again, the idea is that when you're using pentatonic scales, you get a different type of melody, you get a different sound, and you want to have different sounds available to create solos that don't sound the same all the time. So that's an important part of really knowing how to improvise over chord changes anyway, or any kind of difficult progression. And I think this is also an approach that I use really often with any kind of progression. So pentatonic scales are really becoming a huge part of the modern jazz sound, and using them like this is definitely something you want to check out. If you have a way that you're improvising over giant steps that I didn't talk about in this video, then leave a comment. Anybody who's watching this video is of course interested in how you can improvise over giant steps, and I know that I am for sure as well. So leave a comment and share what you have, and then we can all learn something. In fact, there's often some really useful information being shared in the comments to my videos, so that's worthwhile checking out. Another approach to working with giant steps is something that I covered in another video where I'm improvising over giant steps on just one string. Now this is something that of course is going to really help you improvise over giant steps, but it's also just a great way to explore the fretboard and really have a good understanding of where the notes are and where the different arpeggios are placed, arpeggio tones are placed on that one string. So that's also worthwhile checking out. I'll link to that in a card in this video. If you want to learn more about jazz guitar and this is the first time you see one of my videos, then subscribe to my channel. The videos that I publish here every week are on finding some solid methods and good strategies to improve and explore all the great things about jazz guitar and improvising. If you like this video and you want to help me keep making videos, then check out my Patreon page. It's because of the support that I'm getting from my patrons that I can keep on publishing videos every week. I'm very grateful for that, and if you join us over on Patreon, I can also give you something in return for your support. That's about it for this week. Thank you for watching, and until next week.